So this is a piece called 11 that we made in 2012 at Strictly Seattle Velocity's summer dance program. And it was the first piece that we choreographed for anybody other than our company or people, that we had auditioned and hand picked. Also, as you had mentioned earlier, it was the quickest process we'd ever had. I think it was 2.5 weeks. So we had Monday through Friday, I think like 3 hours a day rehearsal process. This is where we met Kim Lusk, who we have ended up working with for I think since then. She was in several different works in different roles in different ways. And that's also where we met Britt Karhoff and Eliza and a bunch of different people. So it's always been a really great sort of way that we get to play with material and learn and make things while also meeting new dancers or getting to work with dancers. The other thing is that this piece then became something that we set and reset again and again and again and again. Like we did it on Cal Arts in Los Angeles, on Cornish College of the Arts. Um,
Did Boca do a version of this?
I think Boko did a version of this. Yeah, a bunch of people have. There's somebody else I can. But yeah, it became something that we then were able to keep remaking and reworking, and um, it's great. And I think also that the Strictly Seattle has always been really fun for us because it's been something that we get to kind of keep. Um, it's a sort of a test, like a laboratory for us, and we develop material that then goes past that and gets to keep being worked out. So that's always been really fun.
Well,
Uh,
it's also in contrast to when we were making these like we'd work on one project at a time, and then that project would tour. And it's with those five, six dancers and those three technician designers,
mhm.
and we all of us would go together. And so, whereas this one would go and get recreated in new ways with new groups of people, which is more of a almost more of like a classic dance company
Mhm.
where you have a repertoire. This would we our repertoire was always very individual based, so we didn't have like a rep company where we would have a bunch of groups of we wouldn't have a bunch of different pieces that we were touring or trying to take around. It
Right.
was we had one piece. This is what we have right now, and then we would move on to another one.
Right.
So this was a stark difference between those.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. 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 So it was the first time that we did not use video or projection or sets or anything like that as well. So, and it was also the first time that we used music that was already made. So, sort of um, not working. We had up until that time we had always worked with a composer like with Morgan Henderson or guy Greg Haynes on composing music, and that it had been a very back and forth process. And this obviously was a unidirectional musical process, as Ravel is dead and had made that a long time ago. Though, as we had talked about in looking for the recordings that we wanted, depending on how it's played, it's either like could be like 9.5 minutes or 16 minutes.
it just reminded me when we were hearing the audience that our idea that we didn't actually want to have the music played during the show.
Right.
And it was like, oh, right. We wanted it to be playing prior to the show starting so
Hmm.
that this
You could
sound
keep
that,
playing it. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, this sound that is coming up, you would have been hearing it in the lobby and maybe right before the piece started. But then when the lights started coming up, there would be no sound. So
Right,
that you would just be imagining this timing and linking those two things together.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
Which maybe like if we weren't doing this in like a 2.5 week process, we'd be able to get there. um,
I
but
think also it would just be kind of close to impossible or something that would have to work so effing hard on for the dancers to be able to be so precisely together when in silence. They probably have to have like in-ear monitors or something so that just they could hear it, and even though the audience couldn't hear it.
yeah,
Um,
you could have the monitors on stage could have had like a click track of some type or something that
yeah.
like isn't going out to the audience, but they can still hear as like, and
I
maybe
think
it's
it
like,
would be better to have it in ear because even a click track wouldn't work. Because I think we had actually tried that at one point.
well, actually it brings up an interesting issue because it's like this in ear requires there to be like batteries and all this, like have a whole another set element, not set element, costume element that then you'd have to, it would dictate the costume too, which would be interesting. It
Hmm.
would change, which, then what I think is sometimes interesting about those kinds of choices is like do you make that choice and change the costume, or do we look for a different thing because the costume matters more than the
Well,
shift
this is like all
that technology does?
hypothetical.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so just to talk a little bit about the beginning image of like, I remember I just had this like image I couldn't get out of my mind of the dancers coming forward in a like split second position split, and that they just sort of were appearing. And I think too that we had talked about, or that I was really interested in having it seem as though they just kept coming and coming and coming, like from out of the space, and sort of as if the space went past the actual confines of the theater itself. And I realized I think that's something that I'm always quite interested in is how far, like how big and how expansive can a space be? And that as if this theater, or like what we're looking at, is just this sort of window into a time that's been happening, or that is continuous, or this place that is continuous, and that we're just happening to sort of open up a little portal at this one time. Do you think maybe, I feel like do you want to maybe turn down the, yeah, music, there you go.
It's like,
We had also talked quite a bit about like that movement right there where their arms are going from the left to the right on the cross on the diagonal. I think I had talked about it as this sort of like ticking of time,
right.
and keeping, yeah, just time. And again, like I said, this sort of very untrained Oh, and then this is that place where in rehearsal one day, Eloise, who's dancing now, had kind of she kept going when everyone else had frozen, and I really liked it. And so again, it was that thing of saying, "Oh, this thing that was maybe supposedly a mistake is actually way more interesting to have it sort of be as if time has frozen and like everything else got pause pressed on it and she just kept going."
It also brings up the issue of like contrast and how going from one contrast to another contrast amplifies maybe what was the original. Like in the sense of like this flowing out of energy and this like sync of this timing as a group, it has a different feeling than as one individual. And so to watch the one individual do something while everyone else is paused amplifies that original idea, I think, in a really interesting way. And trying to and finding those like contrasts um, just sort of
Mhm.
helps elevate like ideas, I think, because it changes the way it feels when everyone's moving together. When you have someone like yeah, just I don't know, somehow it puts in the contrast in a way that's really interesting.
Yeah. Um, the way this was filmed is a little annoying to me, but that's okay. Um, I think, like we had said too, just looking at the costumes that we had, or I guess I should say, I was really originally quite interested in it being sort of like these, I don't know, really strong representations of women. And this was, obviously this idea at that time. So again, it might be quite, not quite different, but there just might be some difference there. And that I was really quite interested in, like, what if they were topless? So we just got to see these really awesome, strong women's bodies with just these blue legs and topless. But just the practicality of dancing topless didn't really let that happen. So instead, we found a version of flesh colored and blue dyed tights and socks, which I made because can't buy them. Um, and then I think, like we had said, this was our first collaboration with Amia, Penny Baker Brown, who's an incredible lighting designer who we then ended up working on two other pieces with her, right? With on Begin Again and Clear and
Clear and
Sweet.
sweet.
Yeah. And this is where I had started to really want to play with the idea of layering and building. And I think sort of really thinking about, okay, well, there's this musically, there's this theme, right? That it never changes, isn't it? Something like 385 or something around then bars of music that then never changes. He just adds instrumentation to it. And
Right.
so that was the idea for this too, is to say, okay, well, how much can I play with a physical theme, a movement theme, and then and then like change and find variation inside of it, and and not just this idea of layering time in a sort of So funny, I can, like, see it in my mind, but, like, in a flat trajectory that moves sort of unidirectional, but if could you layer time and layer sound and instrumentation and bodies as instrumentation and a depth, like, through so not just, left to right or right to left, but also, like, front to back. So it was really trying to play with, adding layers left to right in space, but also front to back. And then also looking at, um, we started playing, or we were playing with shadows here, which you can't, I think because of the angle of the camera, you can't see it very well, but um, that they also added this layer of bodies and people into it. And then here, this is where I was sort of playing with my version or my idea of the Four Little Swans from Swan Lake, which is a very, for people in the, ballet world, is a very famous ballet and kind of like a, I don't know, I guess you could say it's like a test in a way as a dancer of like, can you do this thing of moving in that way? And it's always sort of really rigid and very angular and square. And so I was sort of playing with what I felt like would be a more fun version.
Isn't it also usually uh, a core, like it's part of the core ballet, which is, but also the woman side of the core ballet?
Well, what do you mean the women's side? The women are generally always the court of ballet, and especially in Swan Lake, it's all
Oh,
women.
because
But
I was just thinking about it related to how you were talking about like the women earlier. Like this piece really reflects a lot of this like uh, interesting ideas around the empowerment of how women can be empowered both as individuals and as a core. And so like it makes sense to bring that in as an element of.
yeah, I mean, I think too. I mean, I'm not. I feel like it's important to say that we then, when we've reset this piece, that there's male identifying bodies and dancers as well as female identifying dancers in it, and that it's definitely not um, relegated to only female identifying dancers. It's just that that's who we had at Strictly Seattle that year. And that it feels like it's more about this feminine aspects and a variation and a version and kind of trying to open up one part of a multiplicity of what that is.
Yeah, and like
And
the
this,
onions of the music become like a way of doing that. It's like,
yeah,
and then
this,
also the recreation of it becomes really interesting because you do add in, so it's not stuck in this one version of femininity.
right. And so then this became, this part two is where we're having them go on the upstage side where they're running and then moving around, was also that sense of playing with the feeling that the piece itself and the scope of the piece moves beyond the confines of the stage, so that it's as if it's actually been happening way larger and in a way bigger space.
Right.
And then the silhouetting, you can't, it's kind of missed a little bit where it is here. but also really wanting to play with how many layers, how much is possible inside of a pretty narrow scope, right? Like in a lot of ways it was a very narrow set of resources, right? We had 2.5 weeks, dancers of varying experience. I don't think we had any money at that point from Velocity for the costumes. I think we sort of like had to find them all ourselves. And I think our tech time was like an hour, and just all these different things. But so inside of this very limited, perhaps you could say, palette of lighting and time and space and all of that sort of stuff, like what can you open up from there, and what can be made inside of that, which I think also is part of the bolero itself. Is, again, it's this very small, limited musical phrase that really gets opened up via exploring all of the possibilities inside of it.
Yeah.
It was also really fun to look at, like, oh, it's pretty cute. They really messed that up. But, I think also one of the things that I think I'm always interested in, as well as like community. Oh, and look, and this is where Kristen saved it. She was so smart. They were supposed to all go in together, but they got lost in the music. And here, I'll let them bow. They got lost in the music there and were early, and she could tell. And so she held back in the wings and then ran and slid second, or after they slid, which was so great. She was so smart. It was such a like great decision. Will you go back to that sliding part? We don't have to have any music, but if you just go back to the sliding part. So I remember in rehearsal when yeah, this is great. You can just play from here. You were trying to show them how to slide into place. And
Look, they all got it pretty well.
yeah, they did. They totally did.
I think the slide. I think it was that a lot of times people throw their knees out or something.
Throw their
So like
knees
it would
out.
be well I mean, because when you're sliding, like your intention is to like land on you're throwing your legs forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think I was trying to emphasize that the idea was that you throw your legs forward so that you can land on your thigh and not on your knee.
On your butt, I think, like on your haunch, not on
Yeah,
your.
yeah. So like so that you're
Well, maybe it's.
sliding, yeah, from your this backside,
Yeah.
not from like you're not sliding on your knees. So then I think a lot of times when people start sliding, they don't realize that it's easy
But
to think that you lead with your knee, so you're gonna land on your knee
right.
or land towards your knee, and it's like no, let that thing not land, and so that your thigh and your haunch sort of like hits the ground, and then that's where you're actually sliding on that part.
I think, yeah, my point was that I think it was pretty exciting for them, and pretty funny that, like, oh wait, Juniper also has ideas about the um, how you do movement, not just what it is, but how you do it.
Right.
Just that was pretty fun for them. Um, we had talked about the podcast that we had listened to, and I was thinking that we'll make that a link to that available with the video, the
Yeah.
Unraveling Bolero. and yeah,
Yeah, Radio
I
Lab's Unraveling of Bolero from it must have been like 2000. It was an early Radio Lab
yeah.
episode.
Um, this feels like a pretty long.
Yeah, yeah. I think
I think
I
it's
think
good.
if people have joined us till the end, I super appreciate it. We're
Yeah,
hoping to like, find ways to talk about how we like to make how we got to where we got to with different things that we've created, and also like sort of how that influences how we approach creating new things as we move forward. And so that was sort of the our first attempt
yeah.
of going through
It
and
was
looking
fun.
at work. Yeah. So
So,
thanks for joining us.
so I think yeah. Thanks for joining us. There will be more, and more soon.